Let's do this. The anniversary. You know those mornings when you wake up full of the joys of spring, thinking, today's going to be special. That was me, practically giddy and ready to celebrate 10 years of marriage to Ron. 10 years, a whole decade, such a huge milestone in our lives. This year I'd planned ahead. I'd scrimped and saved for months to buy Ron a watch he'd been eyeing up forever. He wasn't exactly subtle about letting me know how much he wanted it, putting an image of it on his screensaver and mentioning it in every other conversation. So there I was, practically shaking with anticipation, whilst holding his carefully wrapped gift and grinning like I'd just won the lottery. He unwrapped it, looked at the watch and said, "Oh, this is great, I'm made up." And then, as if that wasn't underwhelming enough, he added, "Guess it's my turn to make the tea." Tea? For our 10th wedding anniversary, he must be having me on. I sat on the sofa waiting for him to come back, not just with tea, but with a cheeky grin saying he was joking, and also, obviously, giving me my anniversary present. But the minutes ticked by, no tea, no present, no joke. I was fuming. Finally, I went to investigate and found him in the kitchen, glued to his phone. "What happened to my tea?" I asked, trying to keep it light, even though I was simmering inside. "Oh, sorry, love. Got distracted," he mumbled, not even looking up. "But I've put the kettle on for you." Fantastic. Just what every wife dreams of, a lukewarm gesture to match my lukewarm tea. But it was Saturday, and I wasn't letting him off the hook. "Let's go into town," I suggested. "Do some shopping." He gave me a vague grunt, which I took as agreement, so off we went. When we arrived at the main shopping area of the town, I tried to drop hints even he would get. Pausing at shop windows, gushing over designer handbags and perfume, but he was completely oblivious. By lunchtime I was ready to call it quits. We ended up in a cheap food court of all places, not even a decent restaurant. Ron wolfed down a burger and then, wiping his hands on his jeans, casually announced, "Just got something to do. Be back shortly." As I watched him disappear into the crowd, I thought, finally the pennies dropped. He's off to buy me a present. An hour passed, then 2. I sat there sipping a now cold coffee before finally caving and texting him. "Where are you?" He replied almost instantly. "Do you remember the jeweller's shop we went into 10 years ago? The one where you saw that diamond necklace you loved?" My heart started racing. Of course I remembered. It had been way out of our budget back then, but Ron had promised he'd buy it for me one day. "I think so," I typed back, trying not to sound too excited. Within a second, my phone buzzed with his reply. "The necklace you said was the most beautiful thing you'd ever seen." My throat tightened. Maybe I'd misjudged him. Maybe he wasn't as oblivious as I thought. Quickly I typed, "Yes, I remember," with shaky hands. Then came his final text. "Well, I'm in the pub next door to it. Let's do this." A close shave. It was a misty October morning, and the little barber's shop on Sycamore Street wasn't doing much trade. In fact, it really did. The pedestrians hurried past without so much as a glance, until, that is, a few strange goings-on piqued the neighbourhood's interest. Trim and Shave was run by Mr. Todd, a man with thick glasses and unruly hair that stuck up like he'd been caught in a gale. No one knew his first name, and he wasn't the chatty type, so no one ever asked. His prices were reasonable, though. and he always offered a cup of tea to the few customers who did come in. But people said it tasted odd, and a few had even mentioned feeling a bit dizzy while getting their hair cut. The rumour mill really kicked off when Charlie, who owned the off-licence, went in for a quick trim last Friday afternoon. The next day, Charlie's shop had the close sign on the door. Now that might not have been a big deal, except he was the sort of bloke you could set your watch by. He always opened the shop at 9 o'clock on the dot and didn't close until the street lights came on. The following Monday, Jimmy, who was retired and lived in a flat above the bakery, decided to pop in to trim and shave for a short back and sides. His granddaughter was getting married and he was determined to look sharp for the family photos at the wedding. The little bell above the barber's door tinkled as Jimmy stepped inside, but the shop was empty. "Hello," he called out. "Anyone here?" From the back room a voice replied, "Be there in a second." Jimmy sat down to wait, wrinkling his nose at the odd pong in the air. It was so strong it made his eyes water. After a moment there was the sound of heavy boots and the back door opened to reveal a dishevelled Mr. Todd, wiping his hands on his apron. "Sorry about that," the barber said as he entered. "I've just been doing something in the garden." Jimmy thought he sounded upset. "Planting some vegetables, are you?" A worried look flashed across the barber's face. "Something like that," Mr. Todd replied. "Let me just wash my hands and we can get started. A trim, is it?" "Yes, a short back and sides, please, Mr. Todd," Jimmy replied. "It's my granddaughter's wedding and I've got to look my best." "Lovely," said the barber, who was now rinsing his hands in the sink. "Why don't you go the whole hog and have a shave as well? My razor's always sharp." What an odd thing to say, thought Jimmy. "No thanks, the wedding isn't until tomorrow, so I'll just have a haircut, please." "No problem. Would you like a cup of tea?" came the reply from the barber, who was now drying his hands on a small towel that appeared to have splashes of red on it. Remembering the strange tasting tea from his last visit, Jimmy turned this down as well. "Thanks, but just the haircut." "Suit yourself," said Mr. Todd, and picking up his scissors, set about giving Jimmy a haircut. 20 minutes later, and a smart-looking Jimmy was grateful to step back onto Sycamore Street, taking deep breaths of the cool air. The smell in the shop had made him feel lightheaded. As he ambled the short distance to his flat, he bumped into his landlady, Emma, who was standing outside the off-licence. "You're looking very well groomed, Jimmy. Off somewhere nice?" "Actually, I am," he replied. "I just nipped into the barber's because I'm off to my granddaughter's wedding tomorrow." Emma's expression changed as she asked, "Did you go to trim and shave on Sycamore Street?" "I did," said Jimmy, frowning slightly. "It was a bit odd, to be honest." "Odd? Charlie went in there on Friday, and no one's seen him since," Emma said, her voice lowering. "His shop hasn't been open all weekend." "That is strange. Charlie always opens at the weekend. It's as regular as clockwork," Jimmy replied. "So what happened when you went for your haircut?" Emma demanded. "I'm probably being silly, but the shop was empty when I went in, and when Mr. Todd finally arrived through the back door, he looked upset and his hands were covered in soil." "Soil? What did he say he was doing?" Emma asked. Jimmy replied, "He said he had been gardening, but he looked sheepish to me, and when he dried his hands, it looked like there were splashes of red on the towel. Plus, there was an awful pong." "What did it smell of?" Emma's curiosity was clear to see. It's hard to describe really, but it made me dizzy. I was glad to get out. I think something sinister is going on, Emma said, looking in the direction of the little barber's shop. I think we should go and confront him. Will you come with me for moral support? Of course, but shouldn't we dial 999? Jimmy answered. Emma seemed to consider this, but replied, We don't have any proof. Let's just go and ask what's going on first. And so the two of them retraced Jimmy's steps back to Trim and Shave. As they approached the shop, they looked through the window and saw Mr. Todd sitting in his barber's chair, with his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. Was he crying? The bell rang as they pushed the door open, and Mr. Todd quickly stood up, wiping his eyes. How can I help? He croaked. If you're not happy with your haircut, I'll give you a refund. It's nothing like that, said Emma. There's something fishy going on, and if you don't put our minds to rest, we're going to call the police. Mr. Todd nodded, looking crestfallen. You're right, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'll be glad to get it all off my chest. Both Emma and Jimmy looked aghast. They were right. What was he going to confess? Perhaps they should have called the police after all. First, let me open the door, Mr. Todd said, opening the front door wide and letting in a blast of fresh air. I've got a small gas leak from the boiler in my cellar, he explained. The smell's been awful. It's been making everyone dizzy, but someone's coming to fix it later. Jimmy's shoulders relaxed. So that's what the smell was. But why were you acting so odd when I came in earlier? Mr. Todd hung his head and said tearfully, I decided that if I redecorate, it might drum up some business. So I bought a large tin of red paint, but I dropped it. That explains the red splashes on the towel, Emma said. But what were you doing in the back garden? Suddenly, Mr. Todd started to cry uncontrollably. I dropped the tin on my old cat Sweeney's head. It was an accident, but I'm afraid I killed him. Emma walked over and placed a comforting arm around his shoulders. I know how much you loved that cat, Mr. Todd. What did you do with him? Sweeney always loved this shop, so I decided to bury him in the back garden. That's what I was doing when you came in, Jimmy. This was all starting to make sense. And the odd-tasting tea? Jimmy asked. Mr. Todd gave a rueful smile and said, It was awful, wasn't it? I've been using cheap tea bags to save a few quid, but from now on I'll splash out on the best. Well, that seems to have cleared everything up, Emma said, walking towards the door. The smell, the splashes of red, you acting strange in the back garden. We genuinely apologise for suspecting you of doing anything wrong, Mr. Todd, and I'm sure I speak for both of us when I say we are truly sorry. Mr. Todd waved a hand dismissively. Please think nothing of it, walking with them to the door of his little barber's shop. Oh, one more thing, said Jimmy, turning as he stepped out onto Sycamore Street. What happened to Charlie? Mr. Todd looked confused for a moment, and then, with a tilt of his head, said, Charlie? I killed him, of course. Let's do this. Newly single. When Sarah and I broke up, it wasn't exactly a shock. In fact, we'd both known it was coming for months. It was like being stuck in a long, drawn-out film where you'd worked out the ending before the credits rolled. The silences at home had grown longer, the bickering more regular, and the laughs fewer. We'd fallen into a rhythm of existing alongside each other, not with each other. But knowing it was coming didn't make it any easier when she sat me down one evening and said, I think we've reached the end of the road. I looked at her, searching for any sign of doubt, but all I found was a calm resignation in her eyes. "The end of the road," I repeated, hoping for some sort of reprieve. "There's no point pretending," she said, her voice steady. "It's just not working anymore." So here I am, sitting in our flat. Sorry, my flat now. Staring at the empty walls, feeling more than a little bit lost, unsure of what my future will hold. I can't help but think about how much I'd taken for granted. The shared meals, the pointless arguments about what to watch on the telly, the way she'd laugh at my bad jokes. I was left with half a bottle of wine, a takeaway menu, and rooms that still smelt faintly of her perfume. The worst part wasn't that I'd lost her, but that I was suddenly faced with a life I was totally unprepared for. I couldn't help wondering how I'd manage. Sarah had always taken care of the chores I found dull, sorting out the bills, planning meals, making sure the recycling went into the correct bins. But now here I was, trying to figure out how to survive on my own. A few days later, Tom, my best mate, and his younger brother Dave dragged me out for a pint. I wasn't really very enthusiastic, mainly because Tom was an opinionated sod, even if his opinions were usually wrong. However, as the evening progressed, I found that when it came to getting me back on track, he was surprisingly helpful. "You've got to see this as an opportunity," he said, leaning back in his chair, looking far too smug for someone who hadn't had a serious relationship in years. "You're free now. No more checking in. No more being dragged around the shops on a Saturday afternoon. You can do whatever you want, whenever you want." "Like what?" I replied, finishing the last of my lager and wondering whose round it was next. "Spend my evenings watching endless mind-numbing game shows before going to bed on my own." "You need to change your attitude, mate," Tom said. "Sort out your routine. You've been in couple mode for so long, you've forgotten how to be on your own." Dave, who'd been quietly nursing his pint in the corner, looked up and nodded. "He's right. You can reinvent yourself. Take up a hobby, learn a language, start going to the gym." "The gym," I groaned, already feeling my energy drain. "I hate the gym." "Well, do something," Dave pressed. "You've got no excuse now. Stop moping about. Go out, talk to people. You never know who you might meet." The thought of meeting people made my stomach churn. I hadn't even realised how much I'd become part of a couple until the thought of starting from scratch hit me. The idea of having to begin dating again after all these years seemed exhausting. But then again, I knew they weren't wrong. My routine needed a shake-up. So the very next week, I made an effort. I went to the cinema alone for the first time since university. It felt strange at first, like everyone was silently judging me for being on my own. But I quickly realised no one cared, and honestly, not having to share the popcorn was a revelation. The following evening, I cooked myself a meal from scratch. It was meant to be a chicken curry, but I managed to burn the rice. Still, I ate it, if only to prove I could survive. And just when I thought I was getting the hang of my new life, I signed up for a yoga class. I was under the impression that yoga was a nice, calm, relaxing affair. What I didn't realise was that it was a class full of pensioners who could contort their bodies into shapes I'd never imagined. I spent most of the class trying not to fall over, while they bent themselves into positions that would have put Olympic gymnasts to shame. Bit by bit, I began to feel I could handle this new single life. The flat was quiet, sometimes too quiet, but I got used to it. I started enjoying the fact that I could decide how to spend my time. No compromises, no negotiations, just do what I wanted to do. But there were still moments when it hit me. Usually when I was in the middle of doing something mundane, like taking out the rubbish or making the bed. Little things, things that we'd always done together, that suddenly made me feel incredibly lonely. One of the most difficult adjustments I had to make was shopping in the supermarket. For the last few years, Sarah and I had always done the weekly shopping together. It was an unspoken ritual. We'd argue over which brand of cereal to get, laugh at the ridiculous things other shoppers had in their trolleys, and always, without fail, treat ourselves to a pack of chocolate biscuits. Now it was just me, wandering aimlessly through the aisles, trying to remember how to shop for one. The first time I went, it was a disaster. I wandered around like a lost sheep, unsure of what to buy. How many pints of milk did I need? Was one tomato enough? Is a tin of soup enough for one meal or two? I ended up with a random assortment of items. Eggs, a jar of peanut butter, some cheap pasta, a single banana, oh, and 7 ready meals. I stood in front of the checkout, trying to figure out if I'd made a mistake by buying so little, when the cashier, a pretty girl who couldn't have been more than 20 years old, caught me off guard by saying, "You single then?" scanning the pasta with a bored expression. I blinked. "What makes you say that?" Then glancing at all my shopping lying at the side of the till added, "Was it the ready meals for one?" She glanced up, looked me straight in the eye and said, "No, it's because you're so ugly." Let's do this. The unexpected visit. Emma shut the front door behind her with a sigh that echoed through the silence of her home. The keys clattered onto the hall table as she slid off her heels, grimacing at the ache in her arches. She felt drained, both physically and emotionally. Work had been relentless today, another endless stream of emails, phone calls, and constant carping from her manager. But it wasn't just that. Something had been eating away at her for weeks now. It was Simon, her husband. She'd been noticing his odd behaviour over the last few weeks. The whispered phone calls, the hastily closed laptop whenever she walked into the room, and the strange purchases on their joint credit cards. There was even a booking for a hotel room. Emma didn't want to believe it. Their marriage was strong and the envy of all her friends. But the evidence was stacking up. It didn't take Sherlock Holmes to figure out he was having an affair. To add to her frustration, when she'd built herself up to confront him, rehearsing exactly what she was going to say, he wasn't even home. She glanced at the clock on the wall, nearly 7:30. Simon usually got back from work an hour earlier. She double-checked her mobile, but there was no text. She looked around the kitchen. No note. No explanation. She shook her head, anger building up inside her. Emma made her way to the living room and sank into the sofa. The silence in the house felt heavy, almost oppressive. She stared at the TV remote, but didn't turn it on. Instead, her mind drifted back to their conversation 2 nights ago. "Just a work thing," Simon had said when she casually asked about the late-night phone calls. "You know how it is." But she didn't know how it was. Simon was a plumber, not a secret agent. And who needs to whisper about a leaky tap? She stared at the blank TV screen and saw her reflection staring back at her. Tired, frazzled, and far from the confident woman she used to be. Her stomach clenched. Maybe tonight was the night she'd get the truth. She pushed herself off the sofa and headed upstairs to change out of her work clothes. As she reached the top of the stairs, she froze. The bedroom door was ajar, and there was a faint sound. Was that someone breathing? Was Simon back already? Holding her breath, she nudged the door open and her heart stopped. Two shapes lay under the duvet on her bed, shifting slightly as though trying to get comfortable. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Someone was here. No, two people were here. The realization hit her like a train. All her suspicions, all her doubts had been true, and now, to add insult to injury, Simon had brought his mistress into their home, into their bed. Her vision blurred with fury and betrayal. Her eyes darted around the room, landing on Simon's cricket bat, propped against the wardrobe. Without thinking, she grabbed it. The weight of the bat felt solid in her hands. Logic fled, replaced by a red-hot rage she had never known she was capable of. Grabbing the bat, Emma strode forward, her vision blurred with fury and tears of betrayal. She raised it above her head and brought it down hard on the nearest lump under the duvet. There was a muffled groan. "How dare you!" she shouted, swinging the bat again. She turned her attention towards the second figure, who was now shifting under the covers. Showing no mercy, she rained down blow after blow. The sounds of impact filled the room, mingling with cries of pain, until finally both shapes lay motionless. The only sound, her own ragged breathing. Emma staggered back, the bat slipping from her hands and clattering to the floor. Her chest heaved as she stared at the duvet, now rumpled and stained with something dark. Her body trembling and her mind reeling. What had she done? She stumbled out of the room and down the stairs, her mind racing. She needed to think. She needed to call someone, but who? And what could she say? She was still standing in the hallway, gripping the banister for support, when the front door swung open. She spun round to see Simon standing there, a carrier bag in one hand and a look of mild confusion on his face. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice shaking. "Just popped to the shop. We were out of tea bags." He stopped mid-sentence, his eyes narrowing as he noticed the cricket bat lying on the floor behind her. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Emma felt the room tilt slightly, the weight of what she'd done constricting her chest and making it difficult to breathe. "Simon," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who's upstairs?" He blinked. "What do you mean?" "Oh, surprise!" he grinned, oblivious to the tension in her voice. "I was going to tell you when I got back. I thought it'd be nice to have some family around, so I've been telephoning your mum and dad to arrange it, and they flew up for a visit. They were knackered from the journey, so I let them have a kip in our bed." Let's do this. Christmas confusion. After 3 months of early starts, countless spilled coffees, and more wrong orders than I care to remember, I thought I'd finally got the hang of working at the Sunrise Cafe. My manager, Mr. Rigsby, was nice enough, and although he had some little idiosyncrasies, I'd come to know how he liked things done. But on this afternoon, as he sidled towards me with a strange look on his face, I knew this wasn't a conversation I was going to enjoy. "Sandy, can I have a quick word?" he asked. Here we go, I thought, as I plastered on my best "I'm listening" face. "My wife and I have been invited to our daughters in Cornwall for the Christmas holidays," he informed me, "and I'm leaving you in charge of the cafe while I'm gone." He took my silence as acceptance, and before I could react, handed me the keys, both the till and the front door. "It's only for the rest of the week, and as we're closed on Christmas Day, it won't be too taxing," he said, as he threw on his coat and quick as a wink went out of the door and disappeared into the bustle of pedestrians who were doing last-minute shopping. I stared down at the 2 keys, which were attached to a huge keyring, in my hand. How would I cope, all on my own, over the next 2 days? An hour and several much-needed cups of tea later, for the first time ever I switched off all the lights and stepped into the small porch outside the door to Sunrise Cafe. Turning, I double-checked the door was locked and made my way home, weaving through both the crowds of late Christmas shoppers and the lightly falling snow. After a good night's sleep in my little flat and a long chat with my mum on the phone, I had managed to convince myself that being given more responsibility was a good thing. So with a spring in my step, I set off on the short walk to the cafe. 10 minutes later, I was approaching the cafe when I saw what looked like a pile of rubbish dumped in the doorway. It seemed to be a jumble of rags and was totally blocking the entrance. Well, this is a great start, I muttered to myself as I bent down and grabbed what appeared to be an old yellow sleeping bag. Okay, a man's sleepy voice shouted from within the sleeping bag. I'm going. I nearly jumped out of my skin and quickly retreated back onto the snow-covered pavement. The man's scruffy head emerged from the sleeping bag, his hair sticking up, and he was completely unshaven, his chin covered in stubble. Seeing the shock on my face, he held out his hands towards me in a placating manner. Don't worry, I'm harmless. I'll just collect my things and skedaddle. I could feel my heart racing, but managed to steady my voice and said, What are you doing here? Now busily picking up his assorted things, he replied, I'm homeless. And when I saw you lock up last night, I thought this would be the best place for me to get my head down. Well, you'd better bugger off. The manager will be here in a minute, and you'd better not let him catch you, or there'll be hell to pay, I lied. With all his worldly possessions in his hands, he walked past me saying, Again, I'm sorry for giving you a fright. And he disappeared into the crowd of commuters who were making their way to work. As soon as he was out of sight, I quickly let myself into the shop, making sure to lock the door behind me. What a start to my first morning in charge. The rest of the day passed in a blur of customers, and I was so run off my feet. By the time it came to lock up, I'd almost forgotten about the homeless guy from earlier in the day. However, when the little snow we had turned to sleet as I walked home, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sympathy for that scruffy bloke, and all the others like him, huddling in doorways to keep warm. To be truthful, I was also feeling a little sorry for myself. I'd recently broken up with my boyfriend, and here I was sitting in my one-bedroom flat during what was supposed to be the best holiday of the year, and the most exciting thing I'd done was watch a Christmas movie I'd seen hundreds of times before, and getting the wit scared out of me by a bloke in a sleeping bag. The next morning, Christmas Eve, the weather had turned even colder. In fact, it was so bad that I was wearing an awful woolen hat that Mum had bought me for my last birthday. As I approached the cafe, I could barely believe my eyes. There in the doorway was the same old dirty yellow sleeping bag. Carefully, I went up to it and said in a loud voice, Excuse me, can you wake up, please? The gentle sound of snoring was my only reply. Bending down, I reached out and gave what I presumed was his shoulder a shake. I need to open the cafe. Can you wake up? This time he stared, his scruffy head popping out, and with it a smell of someone who hadn't had a shower in a long time. Morning, he said, whilst doing a strange combination of smiling and yawning. I lost track of the time. He began climbing out of the sleeping bag. I'll be gone in 2 shakes. I stepped around him and unlocked the front door. He seemed pretty harmless, if a bit smelly and in need of a good hot bath. On impulse, I said, Look, I'm just putting the kettle on. Would you like a cuppa? That would be smashing, thanks. And with that, he stepped into the cafe behind me. There's a loo through there, I said, pointing to behind the counter. You can get cleaned up a bit if you'd like. Making a dart for the toilet, he shouted over his shoulder, Cheers, and 2 sugars in mine, please. By the time I'd made the tea and put the open sign on the front door, he'd emerged from the loo. What a difference! He'd shaved, and although his hair could still do with a trim, he'd managed to make it stop sticking up. He almost looked presentable, or at least he didn't look like he'd been dragged through a hedge anymore. Hi, he said. I'm Jerry. This is all very kind of you. I'm Sandy, I replied, handing him his tea. I can't have you starting a day of walking the streets in this weather without having something warm inside you. Would you like a piece of toast? That would be lovely. He smiled, reaching into his pocket, saying, But please, I insist on paying. I started to refuse as he handed me a gold credit card. Is this stolen? I shouted, trying to hand it back. Look at the name on it, he replied, his eyes twinkling. I squinted at the fancy card. Jerry Ledgem. Is that you? I asked in a confused voice. Yes, let me explain. And with that, we both sat down at one of the tables. Every year at Christmas, my friends dare each other to do something for charity, and this year they all decided that I should sleep rough for a week up to Christmas Day. In return, they would all chip in £100 to a local shelter. So you're not actually homeless? I asked, stunned. I'm afraid not. In fact, I actually own this building that your cafe is in. So you're rich? My curiosity was running wild. Let's just say I'm comfortable. And you were the only person to try and be nice to me this week. The bell hanging over the cafe's front door rang as the first customer walked in. I've got to start work, but please stay and finish your tea, Jerry. Oh, I've got nowhere else I'd rather be, he said, with what I now realised was a rather nice-looking smile. My homeless week is up today. I wondered if I could reciprocate your kindness with a Christmas Eve meal tonight. Only if you promise to have a long shower first, I said, turning to serve the customer, while thinking this might not be such a bleak Christmas after all. Let's do this. Everybody knows Ralph. At 6:30, the alarm on my bedside table dragged me out of my dreams into a day I'd been nervously looking forward to for weeks. As I reached for my alarm clock, I accidentally knocked over a half-empty mug of cold tea. This was a dreadful start to a day that had to be perfect. It had to be perfect. Why? Because today was my first day at a new job. Not just any job, a job with my own office. An office with my name on the door. My mum would have been so proud. The night before, I'd carefully laid out what I was going to be wearing. My best suit, a freshly ironed shirt, and polished shoes. Nothing was going to stop this from being the best day of my life. Or so I thought. Little did I know, someone called Ralph had other plans. I arrived at the company car park and began looking for an empty space. When suddenly I slammed on the brakes. I couldn't believe my eyes. Right in front of me was a parking spot with my name on a plaque. After such a bad start to the day, things were beginning to look up. I opened the boot and retrieved a cardboard box of items to personalise my new office. A photo of me receiving my degree, a small engraved clock, which was a present from my last job, and a potted plant my dad had given me. A few bits and bobs to make it feel more homely. When I entered, my new boss greeted me and showed me to my office. I couldn't help but grin like a Cheshire cat. We passed the other workers, a few even glanced up, and I got some polite smiles and nods, even some hellos. An hour later I was settled in and feeling rather smug when I heard a commotion outside in the open plan area. Curious, I got up and opened my door. All I could hear was very cheerful greetings being shouted towards a very nondescript man who'd just entered. It was clear from everyone's enthusiasm that this man, whoever he was very popular. He spotted me standing in the doorway and made a beeline towards me. "Hi, I'm Rolf," he said, holding out his hand. Taking it and giving him a firm handshake, I replied, "I sort of guessed. There must be over 50 people working here and they all seem to know you by name. I'm Ben, the new office manager." Smiling, Rolf replied, "Oh, I know everyone and everyone knows me. It's like my superpower." "Really?" I replied, raising an eyebrow. "Everyone?" Before he could answer, my secretary Sarah joined us and said, "It's true. I don't know a single person that doesn't know Ralph." Trying to hide the look of skepticism on my face, I said, "Well, it was nice to meet you, Ralph. I guess you can add me to the list of people who know you now." And with that, I walked back into my office thinking, nobody knows everybody. After a busy morning settling into the new routine, I received a surprising phone call from one of the owners of the company, Mr. Welby, welcoming me to the firm and inviting me to lunch, which apparently is a rare honour. Half an hour later, and I arrived at the swankiest restaurant in town. I was a few minutes early, so the waiter showed me to the table. I'd just ordered some water when I saw the owner of the company walk in, but he was not alone. To my astonishment, accompanying him was none other than Ralph. I was amazed that as they approached the table, every member of staff they passed, as well as every one of the diners, said hi. Not to Mr. Welby, but to Ralph. And he not only said hi back, but actually seemed to know all of their names as well. It was uncanny. I stood up to greet them and Ralph was the first to speak. "Ben, nice to see you again." "It's good to see you as well, Ralph. I wasn't expecting you." Mr. Welby smiled at us both and commented, "I see you already know Ralph. To be fair, everyone does." "Yes," I replied, shaking my head slightly. "I'm beginning to realise that." During lunch, I learned that Ralph worked as a part-time consultant for the company and also that he was a keen supporter of Chelsea Football Club, the main rivals of my favourite team, Arsenal. "There's a derby match on Saturday," he said. "I know the manager of Chelsea and he's invited me to watch it from one of the private boxes. Why don't you come as my guest?" Surely this couldn't possibly be true. How on earth would Ralph be friends with the manager of one of the biggest football teams in the UK? I decided to call his bluff. "That would be amazing. I'll take you up on your kind offer." "Fantastic. Let's meet for a quick drink before the kick-off in the Rose and Crown pub. It's opposite the main gate of the ground." Having arranged that, Ralph said, "I'm afraid I have to dash. I'm picking my friend Tom up from the airport." Jokingly, I said, "Is that Tom Cruise, the movie star?" Ralph pulled his eyebrows together into a frown and replied, "Yes, it is. He's in London for a few days. Do you know him?" My mouth dropped open, and unable to speak, I simply shook my head. "I've really got to run. Bye." And with that, Ralph quickly left the restaurant, shaking hands with just about everyone as he went. For the rest of the week, I was certain that my phone would ring and it would be Ralph saying that it was all a prank and of course he didn't know the manager of Chelsea Football Club. But my phone stayed silent. So at 2:30 on Saturday afternoon, I walked into the Rose and Crown pub and there he was standing at the bar, surrounded by about 20 customers, all of them laughing and joking, as well as offering to buy their good friend Ralph a drink. Eventually he looked up and I caught his eye. "Ben, great to see you. What are you having?" "I'll have a pint, please." No sooner had the words left my mouth than the barman had poured it and placed it on the bar in front of me, saying, "It's on the house. If you're a friend of Ralph's, then your money is no good here." I nodded my thanks. That afternoon was perhaps the most surreal I had ever experienced in my life. We not only got to watch a great football match, but also were invited to meet the players after the game, who of course all knew Ralph. As we were leaving the ground, we agreed to share a taxi into London, and so I hailed a passing black cab. Jumping into the back, the driver turned and, ignoring me, said, "Where to, Ralph? Are you going to your flat?" "Actually, do you have some time to spare?" I asked Ralph. "I want to try something." "I'm free until 7ish, when I have to ring my friend Donald in the White House," he said with a straight face. "Donald Trump? You know Donald Trump?" "Yes, we aren't close friends, but we have a natter every month or so." Before I could think of a reply, the taxi driver asked, "Where to then?" Smiling to myself, I said, "Buckingham Palace, please." And with that, we set off. Because of the traffic, the journey took nearly an hour, but eventually we saw the magnificent old building, home of the British royal family for centuries. "I'm afraid I'll have to drop you off here," the taxi driver told us. "There's always a crowd outside the front gates." "No problem," I replied, reaching for my wallet. "What's the damage?" "Don't be silly," he said. "I would never charge Ralph." Leaning forward and shaking his hand, Ralph said, "Cheers, Dave. Say hello to your wife and kids for me." A few minutes later, we were standing with lots of tourists outside Buckingham Palace. "So what are we doing here?" Ralph asked. "I'm putting your claim to the test," I said. "You're obviously very popular, but you can't possibly know everyone." With a deadpan look on his face, he simply stated, "But I do." I couldn't help the feeling of triumph coursing through me as I said, "Then of course, you'll know King Charles." He didn't look in the least fazed. "Yes, I've known Charles for years." He'd fallen into my trap. "Prove it," I said. Looking at me like I'd lost my mind, he pointed to the first floor of the palace. "Keep watching that balcony, and I'll get Charles to come out there with me. It should only take a few minutes." And with that, he walked up to one of the guards, who quickly escorted him inside and out of my sight. 10 minutes later, there was a roar from the tourists as King Charles III stepped out onto the balcony, closely followed by, yes, you guessed it, Ralph. I was stunned, but unless my eyes were deceiving me, there was no doubt Ralph and the King appeared to be friends. It simply couldn't be that everyone in the world knows this man. It was baffling. I saw two elderly ladies walking past and hurried over. "Excuse me, I'm really sorry to bother you, but do you know who that man is on the balcony?" I asked one of them, who was wearing a rather fancy red hat. She peered towards the palace and to my relief said, "No, I don't recognise him at all." "Oh, thank goodness, not everyone knows him." My heart started racing. Then turning to her friend, the old lady said, "Enid, do you know who that man is standing on the balcony next to Ralph?" Let's do this. Up the junction. The first time I saw her, she was striding across Clapham Common, hair dancing in the wind. She moved with confidence, like she owned the world and didn't care who knew it. I was on my way home from a mate's place, hands shoved deep in my pockets, with my collar up to ward off the chill. As we got closer, I caught her eye and we smiled at each other, like we'd known each other forever. "Bit nippy for a stroll, isn't it?" she said, her voice almost lost in the stiff breeze. I shrugged self-consciously. "I guess so, but they say exercise is good for you, keeps the blood pumping." She laughed, a warm sound that seemed to cut through the frosty air. "I'm Angie," she said, holding out a gloved hand. "Glenn," I replied, shaking it, half expecting her to pull away and disappear into the night, but she didn't. Instead, we walked together, like it was the most natural thing in the world, the common stretching out before us. We talked about everything and nothing. She told me about growing up in Clapham, about her dad who worked in a bank, and her mum who made the best roast dinners. I told her about my dead-end jobs and my dreams I wasn't quite brave enough to chase. By the time we'd reached the end of the common, I felt like I'd known her all my life. I was smitten. "Fancy a drink?" I asked, half joking, half hoping. She tilted her head, considering me. "All right then," she said, and those two words changed my life forever. Just 2 months later, we moved in together. All we could afford was a basement flat that smelt faintly of mildew, no matter how many air fresheners we hung up. It wasn't much, but it was ours. Angie brought a kind of energy to the place, filling it with laughter and little touches that made it feel like home. A colourful blanket on the worn second-hand sofa, an old lamp we'd found in a skip on the rickety table. We spent our evenings curled up on the sofa in front of the telly, her head on my shoulder. The living room was small, with the wallpaper peeling off its walls, but it didn't matter. We had each other, and that felt like enough. Some nights we'd talk for hours, pondering our future. "One day," Angie would say, her eyes sparkling, "we'll have a little house, a garden for the kids to play in, and a dog." I'd nod along, imagining the life she painted so vividly, a life that seemed so out of reach. Still, we might not have had much, but what we had felt real. We were a solid team, or so I thought. When my dad's mate Stanley offered me a job at the local DIY store warehouse, it felt like a step in the right direction. It wasn't glamorous, just shifting boxes and doing odd jobs. But it was steady work. My first day was a Monday, and I threw myself into the grind. 11 hours a day, 6 days a week. By the time I got home, my body ached, but seeing Angie's smile made it all worthwhile. "Brought you these," I said one evening, handing her a bunch of daffodils I'd picked whilst walking home through the park. Her face lit up. You would have thought I'd given her a diamond ring. My reward was a kiss on the cheek, and that was enough. "You're a good one, Glenn," she said, arranging the flowers in a vase. Our life settled into a rhythm. Work, home, sleep. We started to talk less about dreams and more about the practicalities of making ends meet. But all that changed when she told me she'd seen a doctor and there was a baby on the way. "We'll manage," I told her, trying to sound confident. "I'll work harder, save up." And I did. Through the biting cold of winter, when my breath hung in the air like smoke, I put away every spare tenner I earned. When our old telly broke, we couldn't afford to replace it, so we spent our evenings huddled by the fire, talking about baby names and our hopes for the future. I still remember placing my hand on her stomach, feeling the little kicks from inside, and marvelling at the new life we'd created. It was a freezing January morning when Angie nudged me awake. "It's time," she whispered, her voice tight with pain as a contraction hit. I scrambled to get dressed, my hands fumbling with buttons, trying not to panic. We made it to the hospital in the nick of time. 30 minutes later, our daughter was born. She was tiny, with a shock of dark hair and a cry that filled the room. Angie held her close, and I held Angie. We all had tears streaming down our faces. "She's perfect," Angie whispered. I couldn't disagree. She looked just like her mother, and that was perfect to me. Those early days were a blur of sleepless nights and endless nappy changes, but they were also filled with moments of pure joy. Our little girl, Sandy we named her, was the centre of our world. She took her first steps in the cramped living room, her laughter echoing off the walls. Life was hard, but we had each other, and for a while that was enough. I don't know when it started to fall apart. Maybe it was the long hours at work, or the exhaustion that seemed to seep into every corner of our lives. Maybe it was Angie, or maybe it was me. What's the point in placing the blame? The first time I came home smelling of beer, Angie didn't say much. She just looked at me, disappointment flickering in her eyes. But it wasn't just one time. The pubs became an escape, a place to forget the pressures of work and family. Angie tried to talk to me, to pull me back. "You're not the man I fell in love with," she said one night, her voice trembling. But I didn't listen. Couldn't. I was too far gone, caught in the headlights of my own despair. One day I came home to an empty flat. Her clothes were gone, Sandy's toys missing from their usual spots. There was a note on the table, a few short lines that tore me apart. "I can't do this anymore. Sandy deserves better. Goodbye." I sank into the chair, the weight of her words crushing me. She was gone, and it was my fault. Now I sit here in this dingy kitchen, the walls closing in around me. The happy memories are long gone, replaced by unpaid bills and empty bottles. Sandy's photo is propped up on the shelf, her smile a painful reminder of what I've lost. I think about writing to her, about begging for forgiveness, but I don't. Begging's not my style, and I know she's moved on. I heard through the grapevine that she's with a soldier now, hopefully someone who can give her the life I never could. Still, there's a part of me that hopes that one day I'll see Angie and hold Sandy again, hear her laugh, and tell them both how sorry I am. Until then, I'm here, stuck in this kitchen. I guess I'm up the junction. Let's do this. Silence is golden. "Can you pop into the office for a second, Lisa?" Not good. Definitely not good. She'd heard the whispers about downsizing, and after nearly 3 years in the job, she knew her head would be on the chopping block. Last in, first out, and all that. Was it her imagination, or did her colleagues suddenly find their computer screens fascinating so as to avoid catching her eye the moment she stood up? Straightening her skirt and mustering what little dignity she could, she took the short walk to her boss's office. It felt like a prisoner's last march along death row. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Roberts?" she asked, aiming for confidence, but landing somewhere between polite and petrified. "Ah, Lisa. Come in, take a seat," he said, gesturing vaguely. "I'm afraid it's not good news." 20 minutes later, Lisa was on the bus, staring blankly out of the window as she made her way home to her tiny flat. Her flat may be small, but her savings were smaller, and the prospect of moving back in with her parents loomed large. The thought of her dad's "I told you so" face made her stomach churn. Someone had left a glossy magazine on the seat beside her, and desperate for distraction, she picked it up. Flipping through the pages, she landed on an article titled "Silence is Golden." It featured a ridiculously serene woman standing in a meadow, eyes closed, looking like she'd just won the lottery of inner peace. The article promised to help readers rediscover their purpose through silence. Lisa became engrossed in it and nearly missed her stop, but she made sure to stuff the magazine into her bag before she got off. Back at her flat, she read and reread the article about something called the Silence Collective, a retreat on a Scottish island. It wasn't your typical yoga and candles affair. No, this was proper hard graft. Planting vegetables, chopping wood, milking goats. The kind of thing that sounded rustic and wholesome in print. It felt like exactly what she needed. A week and several emails later, Lisa found herself stepping off a tiny ferry boat, ready to embrace her new life. At the dock, she was greeted by Samantha, the retreat supervisor, late 50s, hair scraped back into a bun so tight it probably gave her headaches, and an expression as neutral as beige paint. "Welcome to Castle Stirling," Samantha said in a voice barely louder than a whisper. "Have you read and agreed to all of our rules?" "Yes," Lisa replied, trying to sound like someone who wasn't teetering on the edge of a panic attack. "I want this to be a fresh start for me." Samantha gave a brisk nod. "The rules are simple. Live in silence, work hard, reflect deeply. If you can do that, you'll do well here." She added, "I'll show you to your room. This will be the last time you're allowed to speak for a whole year." Lisa gulped. "What if there's a problem?" "Then you must wait," Samantha said, her tone firm but not unkind. "When a year has passed, you may discuss any problems with me." And just like that, the silence began. The first few months were brutal. Lisa's thoughts clattered around her head like loose change in a washing machine. Her mum had always called her a chatterbox, and now the quiet felt less like peace and more like punishment. Still, she stuck to it. The work was tough, but oddly satisfying. She mended fences, baked bread, even delivered a lamb once. Gradually, the days blurred into weeks, and the weeks into months. The first annual check-in arrived, her only chance to speak. Sitting across from Samantha, Lisa's voice came out as a croak after a year of disuse. "Try some water," Samantha suggested, sliding a glass across the desk. Lisa took a sip, cleared her throat, and tried again. "Thanks. I love being here." Samantha's lips twitched into what might have been a smile. "Good. Then I'll speak with you again next year. Before I leave, can I just ask if I can have a new light bulb in my room? It stopped working a few months ago, and it means that I can't read during the winter evenings," Lisa blurted out. The older lady jotted something in her notebook. "I'll see to it. Goodbye." True to her word, a new bulb was in Lisa's room that evening. It felt like a small victory. By the second year, Lisa had the routine down to a fine art. She could milk a goat with her eyes closed. But the fish every Friday, oh, how she loathed it. It was her one true bugbear, and she always went to bed hungry on Fridays because of it. When her second check-in came around, she seized the opportunity. "I don't want to be difficult," she said, "but I really don't like fish. Could I have something else on Fridays?" Samantha nodded, made her notes, and waved Lisa off. That Friday, while everyone else tucked into fish, Lisa was served a meat pie. It was amazing. The others looked on with mild curiosity, but of course, no one said a word. That same evening, disaster struck. Lisa's elbow caught a glass perched on her shelf, sending it crashing to the stone floor. It shattered spectacularly, leaving her without a way to drink water in her room. The glass had been there when she had arrived, and she didn't know how to find a replacement. She couldn't even ask anyone. For the next year, every time she was thirsty, she had to trek down the corridor to drink straight from the bathroom tap. Finally, a year later, her annual meeting with the retreat supervisor arrived, and as she strolled in, she noticed the older lady was looking, well, older, and perhaps a little displeased. "How are you, Lisa?" she asked. "Well, I'm fine, but last year I accidentally broke my drinking glass. Could I have a new one, please?" "Of course. Goodbye," she said, and immediately went back to dealing with the papers on her desk. What was surprising was that by the time Lisa had returned to her room, there was a shiny new glass sitting on her shelf. By year 4, Lisa was done. The enjoyment she'd felt when she'd first arrived had abandoned her, and she had made the momentous decision to leave. It felt like time was going backwards as she patiently waited for her yearly meeting to arrive. Finally, it was here. She marched into Samantha's office with her rucksack she had packed the night before, as well as a steely resolve. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous flutter in her chest. "This isn't for me anymore. I need to move on." For the first time in 4 years, Samantha reacted. She let out a long, dramatic sigh that seemed to echo in the silent room. "Well, thank goodness for that," she said, snapping her notebook shut. "You've done nothing but whinge since the day you arrived." Here is a link to all the stories on the channel.